Welcome to Lessons and Stories. This is the channel where every story carries a lesson. Today we're heading to Yaroslavl, Russia, a city so old it was already a major trading hub back when most of Europe was still figuring out which end of a sword to hold. We're going to follow Olga, 36 years old, administrator at a private dental clinic, a woman who spent 14 years being the steady, uncomplaining, quietly dependable half of a marriage. What her husband Andrei didn't know is that the very patience he had mistaken for loyalty was the exact same quality that would make her the most methodical opponent he would ever face. Stick around until the end, because this story is packed with lessons. But before we start, make sure you're already subscribed to the channel and drop a comment telling us what city or state you're watching from. It means everything to us knowing where you all are watching from. All right, let's get into the story. It was a Sunday evening in late May, and the bus back from the dacha was doing what it always did on Sunday evenings in late May, moving at the approximate speed of a philosophical debate with no conclusion in sight. For anyone who's never heard the word dacha, if you're Russian and you have any connection to the earth whatsoever, you probably have one. It's a small country property outside the city, part garden, part retreat, part family religion, where families go on weekends to grow vegetables and have the same argument about the tomatoes that they've been having since approximately 1963. The aisle that evening was a gallery of the sunburned and the hard-working, calloused hands resting on laps, heavy bags of vegetables wedged between boots, necks gone red from an afternoon of May sun. The smell of fresh soil and somebody's fermenting cabbage filled the space with cheerful democracy. Conversations about rain forecasts and fertilizer prices drifted back and forth across the seats. Olga sat by the window and watched the passing fences and vegetable plots blur into a single long green ribbon. She could hear the people behind her debating whether the cold snap was really over this time, and she felt inexplicably at peace, almost comfortable. Which, when you think about it, is not always a sign that everything is fine. Sometimes it's just a sign that you've gotten very good at not looking too closely at certain things. Beside her, Andrei was asleep. He had nodded off at the first stop, his head tipping back slightly, his broad face going soft and boyish in the absence of whatever effort he put into it when he was awake. He was 40 years old, and at moments like this, the defensive architecture all relaxed, he looked significantly younger. Wide cheekbones, even brows, lips slightly parted. She had loved him first for exactly this, the appearance of solidity, of simplicity. With Andrei, things always seemed to make sense. No excess, no performance. He said what he meant what he said, and the rest was silence. She had considered that silence a virtue for a very long time. If she had known, sitting on that bus on that particular Sunday evening, that the next 4 months would be the most consequential of her adult life, she might have tried to pay more attention to the view, committed the fences and vegetable plots to memory, appreciated the cabbage smell. But she didn't know that yet, and the fences were unremarkable, and the cabbage smell was exactly what it always was. Olga Zharova, 36 years old, a woman trained first by her mother and then by life itself in the particular discipline of endurance. She would have called it practicality. Someone watching from the outside might have called it something else. The bus slowed for the stop near the market at the bend in the road. Doors opened. A gust of roasted sunflower seeds and bus exhaust pushed through. An elderly woman with 2 trays of strawberries shuffled out, and a few others pressed forward to take seats. Then Olga felt someone settle into the seat beside her, the one the strawberry woman had vacated. She didn't look right away. When she did, she found a woman of advanced age wearing a printed headscarf pulled close despite the warmth of the evening. Broad, tanned face. Deep lines fanning out from the corners of her eyes, hands folded over a small cloth bundle on her lap, composed and patient as a person who has been waiting for something for a long time and has stopped minding the wait. A Roma woman, not young, not brash, nothing like the kind who work the subway entrances with theatrical urgency and a prepared speech about your destiny, This one was simply still. Olga recognized the general situation and had already assembled her short, polite refusal. She was ready for the outstretched palm, the practiced voice, the offer of secrets for a reasonable fee. She had her "no thank you" all queued up like a woman who has been through this before. Neither came. The woman leaned in slightly and spoke almost directly into her ear, very quietly, the way you tell someone something in a room where you don't want to be overheard. When your husband leaves for work tomorrow, go back to the dacha. Don't go inside the house. You'll see everything yourself. A pause, brief and deliberate. I've seen him on this bus before, not with you. Olga felt something cold pass between her shoulder blades. She gave a small, composed smile and said just as quietly, I don't believe in predictions. The woman didn't argue. She simply nodded. The kind of nod you give when you already know exactly how a conversation ends, and turned her attention back to the window. She said nothing else. 2 stops later she stood, without being asked, without a parting look, without a hand extended for anything. She stepped off into the dusk and was absorbed by the dark stretch of street between 2 distant streetlights. Gone. Just like that. Olga watched through the glass until there was nothing left to watch, and then she sat very still, because she was aware of something she didn't particularly want to be aware of. The words had caught, not because she believed in fortune-telling. She didn't, not even slightly, but because those specific words, not a vague omen, not a warning about a dark-haired stranger, not a prediction about money or health, those specific words had pointed at something she had been for several months now, very carefully not pointing at herself. Pay attention to this detail. She didn't wake Andre. She didn't ask him anything. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked away. That is not passivity. That is a woman who has made a decision without quite knowing yet that she's made it. Andre slept on. His hands lay heavy on his knees. Olga turned back to the window and watched the road until the city lights began to appear in the distance. Dinner that evening was fried potatoes, sliced cucumbers, and tea in mismatched mugs, and the kind of silence that settles over a kitchen when 2 people have been together long enough that they've used up the easy conversation, or possibly have things to say that neither of them is quite ready to say yet. Andre ate with appetite, said something brief and favorable about the food, asked if her mother had called. Then he moved to the other room and turned on the television, which was his primary way of ending an evening and had been for as long as she could remember. Olga washed the dishes and stood at the window afterward, holding a dish towel she had completely forgotten to use. The woman's words were still there, not because she believed them. She had already told herself that twice, and it remained technically true. She was thinking about them because behind the mysticism she had no use for, there was a structure she recognized. It had been built, without her meaning to build it, from things she herself had noticed over the past 3 months. Things she had observed, registered, and then placed very carefully in a drawer she never opened. In February, Andre had driven to the dacha alone. A possible leak in the cellar. In March, once more, new hinges needed on the gate. Twice in April, the neighbors had called about a tree on the fence line. Each reason was plausible. Each one, standing alone, was nothing at all. But when Olga had offered to come along, even once, even just for the air, he had deflected every time. No need to drag yourself all the way out there. I'll be back before you miss me. And a few of those days stretched longer than he'd said they would, with explanations that arrived smoothly and explained nothing specific. Then, in the last week of April, she'd found a receipt in his jacket pocket when she went to hang it up. A small plastic bucket. A toy shovel. He said he'd picked them up for the neighbors' kids, they'd asked him. She believed him. Or she told herself she had. In March, she'd seen a transfer on the shared account. A notable sum, labeled simply building materials. He explained it quickly. Logs for a lean-to awning. Easier to transfer than carry cash. She hadn't pressed. And here is where I need to stop for 1 second, because there is a pattern forming that the narrator in me cannot let pass without comment. His card was blocked. His payment wasn't going through. He'd pay her back next week. The awning needed logs. The neighbor's kids wanted a toy shovel. Look at that list. Each item, individually, sounds like a perfectly reasonable thing a married person might say. Together, they sound like a man who had discovered that his wife would accept almost any explanation as long as it was delivered without hesitation. That is not a husband in a difficult patch. That is a man who had done a very careful study of exactly how much he could get away with. Run on pure emotion, and you'll always leave a door cracked open for the other person to walk through. Olga didn't run on emotion, she ran on information. And the information, considered calmly in a kitchen at 11 in the evening with a forgotten dish towel in her hands, was beginning to suggest that she had been filed away under the label patient wife by someone who found that category extremely convenient. None of it was enough on its own. That is precisely how these things work. The erosion is so gradual, you don't feel the ground shifting. You only notice when you are standing somewhere entirely different from where you thought you were. And the distance between the 2 points is too wide to pretend you misread the map. She went to bed late. Andre was already asleep by the time she lay down, breathing with the steady, settled rhythm she had always read as the sound of a man with a clean conscience. Lying in the dark, ceiling pale above her, his breathing filling the quiet room, she found herself no longer certain whether that was what it was, or simply the sound of a man who had learned, over a long time, to put certain things entirely out of his mind before he closed his eyes. She made a decision. Not a dramatic one. A quiet one, the kind that arrives without announcement and settles in without asking to be acknowledged. She was going to go to the dacha in the morning, not because a woman in a headscarf told her to, because she had been patient long enough to understand that patience without information is just slow surrender in nicer clothes. She did not cry. She did not shake him awake. She closed her eyes and went to sleep. Hold on to that. Because everything that follows, every single thing, starts right there, in that silence and that closed-eyed clarity. In the morning, Andre rose at 7:30, made himself a sandwich, drank 2 cups of coffee standing at the kitchen counter the way he always did, and packed the canvas work bag he used on service call days. Tools, gloves, the spare jacket he kept for jobs that got messy. He said the assignments were on the far side of the city, back around 7 in the evening. Olga kissed him on the cheek. She listened to the front door close. She waited 10 minutes, long enough for him to reach the courtyard, start the car, pull into the street, and then she took her light jacket from the hook, picked up her bag, and walked out. The morning was clear and warm. May in Yaroslavl has a particular quality of light. Unhurried, almost amber, the kind that makes ordinary streets look like they're being photographed for a postcard nobody asked for. The world offering up its beauty on a day she wasn't particularly in the mood to receive it. She boarded the bus at the stop 2 blocks from their building, found a seat near the window, and watched the city loosen into suburbs, and the suburbs loosen into the green edges of the Dacha Road. Olga got off 1 stop before the main entrance, cutting through a neighboring plot whose owners hadn't appeared in years. The shrubs there had grown unchecked into a dense wall of green, shoulder-high in places, thick enough that a person standing behind them would be completely invisible from the road. An old shed on the property sat almost directly across the narrow path from their own gate. She checked her watch. Just past 11:30. Here's something most people in the States wouldn't know about how these Russian dacha communities actually work. The plots aren't scattered like American lake houses. They're organized into gardening cooperatives, planned communities of small lots with shared roads, a water line, and an elected chairman. Neighbors are separated by fences you could lean over and hold a full conversation across. People who've been coming to the same cooperative for 40 years know the rhythm of every plot. Who comes when, who brings whom, and what cars park where. That detail is going to matter. The sun was high and white. Birds were conducting their business in the overhead branches with the urgency of people who have a great deal to say and very little time in which to say it. The smell of lilac came in waves thick enough to eat. She stood behind the corner of the shed, and she waited. She had told herself she was prepared to stand there a full hour and walk away having seen nothing. Prepared to take the bus home and spend the afternoon acknowledging, with some embarrassment, that she had driven herself out here on the strength of a stranger's whisper. She was genuinely ready to discover she had invented a problem. She had been there less than 20 minutes when a white minivan appeared at the end of the road. Watch her face here. Or rather, notice what is not on it. No gasp, no hand pressed over the mouth. Her expression does something much quieter. It goes still, not frozen, still. There's a difference that matters. Frozen is shock, still is recognition. She knew the van. It belonged to an acquaintance of Andre's who lent it out occasionally for moves or heavy loads. Andre had used it before, always with a sensible reason attached. The van slowed and stopped in front of their gate. The engine cut. The driver's door opened and Andre stepped out, still in the work jacket he'd been wearing when he left the apartment 2 hours earlier. Then the passenger door opened and a young woman stepped down, dark-haired, turning to pull her hair back as she said something over her shoulder. Then, from the sliding rear door, a small boy launched himself out onto the path. He was perhaps 5 years old. He wore a red jacket and rubber boots. He ran immediately forward without looking back, the way children run when they know exactly where they are going. Andre moved to the back of the van and began unloading bags, not one or two, several, the kind of quantity you bring when you're not planning to leave before dark. The young woman said something to the boy, who laughed and kept running. Andre produced a key from his pocket, their key, the one that fit their lock, and opened the gate without looking at it, without pausing. The way you open a gate, you have opened 500 times before. Careful, Kirill, the woman said. Don't run on the wet steps. Andre answered a moment later, in that particular low, unhurried voice that Olga would have known in a crowd of 1,000. He's fine. He knows his way around. 5 words. 5 words that told Olga everything she needed to understand about how long this had been happening, and how fully at home everyone involved had already become. She stood with her shoulder against the rough wood of the shed and she closed her eyes. She did it deliberately, the way you press your palm flat against something solid to stop yourself from swaying. She stayed like that for several seconds. Then she opened them again. The gate was closed. All 3 of them were inside. Through the open kitchen window, their kitchen window, with the curtain she had repaired herself the previous summer, she could hear voices, muffled, conversational, completely at ease. The words were impossible to make out, only the tone came through. Domestic, unhurried, comfortable. Then the wind shifted direction, and one voice rose just enough. Do you even understand that I can't keep doing this? And then Andre's voice, measured and deliberate, performing the careful patience he used when he was managing a situation rather than resolving it. Liuda, I explained this. We can't move quickly right now. If I act too soon, she's going to start fighting over everything. I need more time. A pause. You've been saying that for a year. Give me 6 more months. The dacha is our place for now. After that, everything. Everything. He promised her everything, which is a fairly generous offer to make with a property that had been maintained in no small part at someone else's expense. The audacity of that word, everything, is something the narrator is going to need a moment to appreciate. He was standing in a house partially funded by his wife's bank account, promising it as a romantic gesture to another woman. If that doesn't deserve a slow, appreciative round of applause for sheer nerve, I genuinely don't know what does. Olga turned and walked back up the path the way she had come. Even steps. No hurry. She did not look back. The lilac was still relentless. The birds were still entirely indifferent to human drama. The sun was warm on the back of her neck. The world remained completely itself, and something inside her, not violently, not with any particular announcement, closed. Not slammed, closed, the way a door closes when there is no longer a reason to go back through it. And here's the thing about that kind of pain. It doesn't surprise you, which, in some ways, is the worst part. When you're blindsided, at least you have the comfort of the blindness. When you already knew the shape of it, when you've been filing the evidence quietly for months and telling yourself it wasn't enough, there's nowhere to hide. You just have to stand there and let the thing you already knew become the thing you now know for certain. The bus back to the city was nearly empty at that hour. Olga sat on the same side she always sat on and watched the same fences and gardens slide past the window in reverse. She almost picked up her phone twice, not to say anything, just reflex. The muscle memory of 14 years with a person, reaching for them before the thinking brain has caught up with the news. Both times she put the phone back in her bag. He was there, in that house, with the grocery bags and the woman named Liuda and the boy in the red boots who already knew his way around, who had apparently been learning his way around for quite some time. At the station, she bought a coffee from the small kiosk near the platform. Too bitter, too hot. She stood and drank it in steady sips, looking at the rails. Her mother had always said that pain is just information. She had found this cold for most of her life. Standing on a train platform in May, with a clear head and a bad coffee, and no more room left for pretending, she found it, for the first time, entirely exact. She didn't take a cab home. She took the elektrichka, Russia's commuter rail connecting cities to their dacha communities. Think of it as an old regional Amtrak, except louder, considerably slower, and with vendors selling grilled corn in the aisles. On this particular afternoon, it happened to be almost empty. Olga found a window seat and sat alone with her thoughts, which was exactly what she needed. She opened the small notebook she always carried for work and turned to a clean page. The train moved through the outskirts of the city. Industrial yards, low buildings, birch trees appearing in the gaps. She watched the landscape without seeing it, her pen resting on the open page, and she let her mind go back through the years in the orderly way she went through everything. The well, drilled 3 years ago. His card was blocked that day, so she had transferred the payment. He'd pay her back the following week. He had not. The heating boiler. He'd asked her to cover half the deposit. He'd pay her back as soon as it cleared. It had never cleared, apparently. The 5 windows, 2 transfers sent the same afternoon. Hers went first because his payment was being delayed. Between us, his card was blocked, did a lot of heavy lifting in this marriage. At this point, the card had been blocked so many times it should have had a reserved parking spot. The page filled slowly. Buildings gave way to open fields. Fields gave way to the first suburban stations. By the time she reached the city, the page was nearly half full. Her shoulders were back. Her jaw was level. She wasn't performing composure for anyone. There was no one watching. It was simply where she had arrived. And this is why that matters. The posture of someone who is processing, not drowning, not raging, not falling apart, but thinking, is one of the quietest and most consequential things you will ever see. She had not planned a strategy yet. She didn't need one that day. What she had done was more fundamental. She had looked at the situation directly, named what she saw, and refused to blink. That is not a small thing. Most people can't do it. Most people look away, or soften what they see, or tell themselves a more comfortable story until the comfortable story becomes the only one they know how to tell. Olga was not most people. She never had been. She simply hadn't needed to prove that yet. That evening, Andrei returned just before 8, hung up his jacket, went to wash his hands. He came to the kitchen and said he was exhausted. 2 calls on the far side of the city, and then the traffic coming back. He sat at the table and ate the soup she had made with the appetite of a man who had worked hard and felt entitled to his dinner. "The soup is good," he said. "Old recipe," she answered. "Nothing special." The conversation ended there, as their kitchen conversations had a habit of doing lately. Months ago, the silence had bothered her. She'd read it as a warning sign, a gap that kept widening. Tonight, the silence was convenient. She didn't have to manage her own face. She could sit across from him and think clearly without performing anything at all. Look at that. Look at how completely she has separated what she feels from what she shows. That is not coldness. That is a woman who has understood, precisely, that the most dangerous thing she could do right now is show her hand. After dinner, he moved to the television room. Olga cleared the dishes, dried the counter, and walked to the front hallway closet. Bottom shelf, behind a box of tools, an old cardboard folder, brown and slightly soft at the corners where they kept the dacha documents. She carried it to the kitchen, closed the door behind her, and spread its contents across the table. The deed, the property under Andrei's name, inherited from his father 12 years before their wedding. That part she had always known. The dacha was his in the way certain things in a marriage are understood to belong to one person without being said aloud. She had never disputed it. never thought of it as jointly owned. It wasn't. She had known that going in. But further into the folder were the documents she had been thinking about since the train. The drilling contract for the well, dated 3 years prior, the invoice, the payment confirmation, on her name from her account because his card had been blocked that morning. He had mentioned repaying her the following week. He had not mentioned it again, and neither had she. The heating system contract, 2 years ago, his signature. But the deposit receipt had been sent from her account, half of it, while his bank was processing something. He'd pay her back as soon as it cleared. The window replacement, 5 units, her choice of profile and opening style, their payment split in 2 transfers, sent the same afternoon. She photographed every document page by page carefully. At one point, the phone screen was too bright and she had to cup her hand around it to keep the light from reaching the bedroom. Crouched over a kitchen table at midnight, one hand blocking the glow, the other steadying the shot, photographing her husband's property deeds by phone flashlight while he slept 8 feet away. If there was a more Russian scene available anywhere in the country at that particular moment, she couldn't imagine what it was. Then she replaced everything in the folder in the same order it had been and put it back exactly where it had been sitting. She went to bed after midnight. Andre's breathing was steady and even beside her in the dark. The most difficult thing about a long betrayal is not the moment of discovery. The most difficult thing is the arithmetic of it. The slow, cold calculation of how long everything was already in motion while you were doing the dishes, mending curtains, not asking the questions you almost asked, while you were useful, while you were convenient, while you were the stable part of someone else's 2-track life. She lay in the dark and did the arithmetic, and when she was done with it, she let it settle. She did not carry it into the morning as rage or tears or confrontation. She set it down where it belonged, in a column of confirmed facts, and she closed her eyes. In the morning, she called into the clinic and asked for a personal day. Then she opened her contacts and found the name her colleague Svetlana had passed to her 6 months earlier, quietly, without ceremony, in the way women share certain kinds of information with other women when they understand that the time may come. Just, if you ever need a lawyer, he's good, no drama. At the time, Olga had thanked her and filed the name away. She had told herself it was just in case. In case had arrived. His name was Igor Safronov. He practiced out of a plain business center. No dramatic signage, no marble lobby, no wall of diplomas arranged for maximum intimidation. A small office, a desk, 2 visitor chairs, a shelf of matching gray folders. Safronov himself was around 40. Neat in the way of a person who considers precision a professional obligation. He spoke slowly and never finished a sentence before he'd finished thinking it through. Olga appreciated that immediately. She told him what she knew, not what she suspected, not what she felt, what she could confirm. She laid it out the way she laid out everything at work, the facts in order, the gaps clearly marked, the relevant documents noted. She had observed her husband at their dacha property in the company of a young woman and a child, approximately 5 years of age. She had heard a conversation through an open window indicating this was a regular, ongoing arrangement and that her husband was actively managing the timing of a divorce with financial outcomes in mind. She had documents showing that significant marital investments had been made in the property, partially and in some cases entirely from her own account. Safronov listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Do you have the contracts with you?" "Photographs. The originals are at home." "Good." He opened his laptop. "Let's go through this in order." He explained it without theatrical sympathy and without bureaucratic coldness. The property, inherited before the marriage, falls under personal rather than marital property. That part was not going to change. No court would reclassify it as jointly acquired. Here's something worth understanding about that distinction, because it matters enormously. In Russia, inherited property stays with the person who inherited it. Same basic rule as in most American states, where inheritance is classified as separate property and is not divided in divorce. But here's where the law grows teeth. If marital money was used to substantially improve that inherited property during the marriage, drilling a well, installing heating, replacing windows, a court can order financial compensation for the contributing spouse, not ownership of the property, compensation for the documented investment. The difference between those two things is the difference between losing everything and getting back what was always yours. And the proof lives entirely in the paperwork. The well, the heating system, the windows, Olga said. If you have contracts with dates and amounts and payment documentation showing your card was used, that is a serious conversation, Safronov said, particularly if the total is substantial relative to the original value of the property. It is. Then we have something to work with. He paused. But that's not the only thing you need to be thinking about right now. He explained. If her husband had been strategizing around a divorce for at minimum a year, then the moment he understood she knew, the clock would start. He might transfer the car to a relative, move savings, take out credit against shared assets. People who know what's coming move quickly. How much time do I have? She asked. As much time as he doesn't know you were at the dacha. Olga nodded. She let the weight of that settle for a moment. Then, I need to go back, with a camera, to document what's there. Safronov considered this with the expression of a man who has seen clients at this stage do everything from sob into their briefcase to demand measures the law cannot offer. Photographs alone won't be decisive in a property dispute, he said, but as part of a larger picture showing how the property was actually being used, they have value. Stay on the outside. Only photograph what's visible from the path. Don't let them see you. She wrote everything down in her notebook. Before she left, he said, most people in your situation either break down at this point or freeze completely and do nothing. You're doing a third thing. A pause. You're holding together very well. I don't want to lose what I put in, she said. That, he told her, is exactly the right strategy. She picked up her bag, shook his hand, and walked out into the ordinary afternoon. The business center lobby was quiet. A man reading his phone on a bench, a receptionist moving papers from one pile to another. Nothing that knew what had just been set in motion in a small office on the third floor. Now, here's something most people in the States wouldn't know about Olga's job. Back home, a dental office manager answers phones and reports to the doctor. In Russia, a private clinic administrator is the operational spine of the entire practice. Appointments, suppliers, patient records, billing, and staff, all simultaneously. You don't last in that role by being vague. You last by being exact, by noticing what's off before it becomes a problem. Worth knowing this about who she was, and about why the next few weeks went the way they did. She returned home in the late afternoon. Andrei was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with his phone. He looked up, asked where she'd been. She told him, without hesitation, that she'd been at her mother's, that Vera Pavlovna had wanted help rearranging the furniture in her room. That was the first lie she had told in 14 years of marriage. She said it without a single extra word, without a tremor, without the slight over-explanation that gives lies away. He nodded and went back to his phone. 3 days later, on a Wednesday, she went back to the dacha. She brought the small binoculars that had been sitting in the closet since a birdwatching trip years before. Still in their case, still perfectly functional. She was in position behind the shed by 10:15. She waited nearly an hour this time. The morning was warm, smelling of young leaves and sun-warmed earth. Somewhere behind the neighboring plots someone was working with a hammer, the sound coming in slow, irregular beats. Olga stood without moving, and her thoughts were, remarkably, calm. Not numb, calm. There's a difference. Numb is the absence of feeling. Calm is feeling held in order. At 11:20, the white van turned onto the road. She began filming as soon as it stopped. Wide shot first. The van, the license plate, the gate. Then Andrei stepping out with the bags. The woman coming around from the other side, reaching to adjust the boy's collar before letting him run ahead. The items already hanging on the porch line. A child's blue windbreaker, small socks, a towel with a cartoon animal printed on it. She photographed the line separately, then put the phone in her bag and simply looked. The woman was younger than Olga, Early 30s at most, soft features, dark hair pulled back. She moved without rushing, without looking around, without any of the watchful attention of a person who feels they might be seen somewhere they shouldn't be. She moved like someone at home, because she was. She had been, apparently, for quite some time. The boy called her Mama, clearly, and without lowering his voice, the way children announce things they have no reason to conceal. Andre said something to the woman in a low voice. She listened, nodded, and then laughed. Quiet and easy, the laugh of someone in a conversation they're not performing for anyone. A domestic laugh, a familiar one. Olga put the phone away, turned, and walked back through the bushes. Her legs were steady, her hands were steady. Under her ribs, there was something dense and cold that was not grief and not fury, something older and more durable than either. The thing you build decisions from, not scenes. She knew enough. Now she needed the rest. On Friday morning, she called the clinic again and asked for one more personal day. Then she took her jacket, her bag, and the notebook she had been filling slowly and steadily all week, and she went to see her mother. Vera Pavlovna lived 2 bus stops away in a 2-room apartment that smelled permanently of fresh baking and had violets on every windowsill. She was 60 years old and belonged to the category of women who do not comfort, they inform. She had raised Olga on the principle that a clear understanding of a difficult situation is always preferable to a soft one, and she delivered her truths without cruelty, but without the kind of cushioning that ultimately helps no one. Olga had found this hard at various points in her life. Today, she found it exactly what she needed. She sat at her mother's kitchen table and told her everything, from the beginning. The bus, the woman in the headscarf, the 2 trips to the dacha, what she had seen, what she had heard through the window. Safronov, the documents, the photographs on her phone, the notebook. She spoke the way she always spoke when presenting a problem, methodically, without decoration, leaving nothing out that was relevant, and nothing in that wasn't. Vera Pavlovna listened without speaking. She stood once to turn off the kettle and sat back down immediately. When Olga finished, her mother was quiet for long enough that it had its own weight. Outside, the courtyard hummed with ordinary city noise. The kitchen clock ticked. The silence went on exactly as long as it needed to. So, he's been bringing them there for a while, her mother said at last. Not a question. From what I could see and hear, yes. Vera Pavlovna pressed her lips together. Not in shock. In the particular controlled anger of a woman who thinks before she speaks, and right now was thinking things she would not say aloud because they would not be useful. She did not ask how this was possible. She did not ask how long Olga had suspected. She went directly to what mattered. So he solved the problem of not having children with you, she said, by having them somewhere else. A pause. And you went to the lawyer first? Yes. Good, not to him, to the lawyer. Her mother nodded once, firmly. Tears and confrontation are exactly what he wants right now. He needs you emotional. He needs you making demands he can manage. He's been preparing this exit for a long time, and a crying wife fits perfectly into the version of this story he's already written. She looked at Olga directly. You know how he gets. In any difficult situation, he always looks like the calm, reasonable one. Always. That's exactly why I haven't said anything yet. Then keep not saying it. Stay quiet and gather everything you can. She asked what Olga needed. Documents. Vera Pavlovna had, some years ago, asked for a copy of the window installation contract because she'd wanted to verify the price herself. She'd also been holding an envelope of building supply receipts that Olga had left with her during an apartment move, afraid of losing papers in the chaos of packing. Both items were retrieved without drama. Her mother set them on the table and said simply, "These are your money. Don't let him build a story where he did everything himself out of thin air." At the door, Vera Pavlovna held her daughter's hand for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, "The quieter you are, the better this goes." I know. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway." Olga walked back to the bus stop in the warm May afternoon, her bag a little heavier, her position a little stronger. That Saturday, Andrei drove to the dacha alone, as he had said he would. He came back in the evening carrying a bunch of radishes and a satisfied expression. Everything fine, cellar dry, fence holding. He set the radishes on the counter with the quiet pride of a man presenting something that required significant effort, which a bunch of radishes does not. He mentioned he might go again the following weekend to fix the downspout. Of course, Olga said. Go ahead. She put the radishes in the refrigerator and asked pleasantly whether they needed anything from the hardware store for the repair. He said no, he had what he needed. He looked at her for just a fraction of a second longer than usual after she said that. Not suspicion exactly, more like a person who expects a familiar shape and notices, without being able to identify why, that something is slightly different, like a man who has been told his soup tastes exactly the same and yet somehow it doesn't. She smiled at him easily and turned back to the counter. He let it go. The following Monday, she was back in Safronov's office, this time with printed photographs of every document and the envelope of original receipts. The lawyer spread everything across his desk and spent a long time looking, occasionally making a short note, occasionally placing one paper beside another to compare dates. Good, he said finally. He went through the items in order. The well, payment confirmation in her name, date, amount, documented. The heating boiler, deposit traced to her account with the contract providing context, documented. The windows, installation contract with the full cost stated, her payment transfer on record, documented. The building materials receipts, itemized, dated, some with handwritten notes providing additional context. The combined amount is significant, he said, sufficient that a court would find it difficult to dismiss as incidental maintenance. This represents capital investment, infrastructure that materially increased the property's value during the marriage. What's the realistic outcome? The property stays with him. That's not moving. Inherited title is inherited title. What we're pursuing is financial compensation for your documented share of the investments made during the marriage. Courts have granted this when the paper trail is clear, yours is clear. He set his pen down. There's one other piece you need, he explained. To reinforce the overall picture in the divorce proceeding, it would help to establish that the property had been used as a regular residence by a separate household, that it had, in effect, been functioning as a second home. You need someone who saw them there, more than once. Olga thought for a moment. Natalia Bekharova, 2 plots down. She's been in the cooperative for years. She notices everything. Talk to her, informally. Don't ask her to testify. Just have a normal conversation and let her tell you what she saw. If what she saw is useful, she becomes a witness. He also mentioned the cooperative chairman, a man named Samokin. Any maintenance requests, waste removal orders, or utility inquiries that Andrei had filed when Olga was not present would show the property was being actively managed and used on a regular basis. Visit the office. Ask about membership dues. Let him talk. Olga wrote both names in her notebook, thanked him, and left. That Wednesday evening, she called Natalia Bekharova. They hadn't spoken in a while, and Natalia was delighted, dove immediately into cooperative news, the new fence near the entrance, how early the lilacs had come this year. Olga listened and asked small questions and let the conversation find its own current. Then, as naturally as one thing leading to another, she mentioned that Andrei had made a few trips out there on his own when she hadn't been able to get away from work. Had Natalia happened to see him? Oh, of course, Natalia said, without any hesitation at all. He was out there quite a few times, and not by himself, by the way. There was a young woman with him, dark hair and a little boy. I actually thought for a second it might be you with a new haircut, a pause containing a small social laugh. But then I looked more carefully and thought, no. Natalia, bless her heart, had almost gone over to ask who they were. It had felt awkward. The little one was a lively kid, always running up and down the path. They used to take him to the playground near the entrance. She'd seen them at least 3 times, maybe more. Olga thanked her warmly and ended the call. She wrote in her notebook, Bekharova, confirmed 3 or more sightings, child, playground. The following day, she stopped into the cooperative office on the pretext of clarifying the membership dues. Samokin, the chairman, was a heavy-set, good-humored man who offered tea from a large striped thermos the moment anyone crossed his threshold, offered it with the urgency of a man who has been waiting all morning for someone to offer it to. He had 3 different ledgers open on his desk and was clearly pleased to have a visitor who might require a 4th. Olga asked in passing whether there had been any issues with her plot. Her husband had mentioned something about the water line that she hadn't entirely followed. Samokin lit up. He stood, which he didn't strictly need to do, pulled a folder from the shelf behind him with the practiced flourish of a man who has been waiting for exactly this question, and spread it open on the desk. Andrei Zharov, he said, had filed a request in April to have the water supply pipe inspected. He'd also arranged 2 additional waste collection runs that spring. The container had been filling faster than usual, and the previous September he had approached Samokin to ask whether the cooperative had any plans to expand the children's playground near the main entrance, noting that the number of families with young children seemed to have grown. Samokin had made a note of this suggestion at the time. He produced the note. It was in a separate folder. "He's a responsible owner," Samokin said approvingly. "Yes," said Olga. "He always has been." She stepped outside and stood for a moment at the office door, looking at the road. A man who filed maintenance requests for a property he was running as a second household. A man who lobbied to expand the children's playground because the child he had been quietly raising nearby enjoyed it. A man who, by all administrative measures, was a model cooperative member. The nerve of that, honestly, the complete and total nerve. She took out her notebook, made a short note beside Samokin's name, and walked to the bus stop. She had everything she needed for the next step. The conversation that ended the marriage happened on a Tuesday, not scheduled. It happened because Andrei came home earlier than expected, just before 6, and Olga had not yet moved the printed photographs from the kitchen table where she had been reviewing them before a work call. She heard the key in the lock. She left the photographs where they were. He came in, set his bag down, walked through to the kitchen and reached for the kettle. A few seconds passed before his gaze traveled across the table. The van at the gate, the child's windbreaker on the porch line, a wide shot that included the gate, the path, and 2 figures standing at the entrance to their house. He stopped. His hand was still on the kettle handle. His fingers went white at the knuckles. He stood like that for a full 3 seconds, not moving, not speaking, with the kettle handle gripped as though it were the most neutral object in the room and he needed something neutral to hold on to. Then he set it down, very carefully, on the counter, and he turned. "What is this?" "Photographs," Olga said. Her voice was level. Not cold. Level. There is a difference. "I went to the dacha 2 weeks ago, and again 3 days after that." He stood looking at the photographs. She watched his face the way you watch a clock. Not looking for emotion exactly, but for the sequence of what came when. First came the surprise, and it was genuine. A brief tightening around the eyes, a slight forward lean as he looked more closely, as if proximity might change what the images showed. Then the surprise passed. What replaced it was something she had seen in him before, in other difficult conversations. The jaw settling, the shoulders dropping fractionally, the whole posture reorganizing itself around a new calculation. How much does she know? What's the most defensible position from exactly here? He had always been good at this. She had always found it reassuring, once upon a time. "This is the wife of someone I know," he said. His voice was steady, his eye contact direct. "They had nowhere to stay for a few days. I let them use the dacha." He delivered it with perfect composure, an explanation so clean it could have been laminated and framed. And this is the part that would have worked in an earlier version of this marriage, on an earlier version of Olga, because it was just plausible enough, and because she had believed plausible things before. "Andrei." She said his name quietly, with no anger in it at all. "Don't." He stopped. Something moved in his face, very fast, very small. A recalibration of a different kind. "I heard your conversation through the window. The first time I was there, you told her that moving too quickly would cause me to fight over everything. You told her you needed 6 more months. You called her Liuda, and she spoke to you the way a person speaks to someone they've been with for years. A pause. I'm not asking you to explain the photographs. I'm telling you what I already know. What happened to Andre's face in the next few seconds is worth describing slowly because it doesn't happen often. The moment a man who has been managing a situation for years realizes the situation has been managing him back, the composure didn't collapse. It shifted. The jaw, which had been set with the confidence of someone about to talk his way out of a room, loosened slightly. His eyes moved to the photographs again, briefly, then back to her. His hands, which had been at his sides, came up, and he pressed them against the back of a chair, not gripping it, just resting them there, as if the chair might be useful for something, but he hadn't decided what yet. He sat down, he put his face in his hands. He stayed like that for a long moment, elbows on the table, palms covering everything from cheekbone to forehead, the posture of a man buying the only currency he had left, which was time. When he looked up, his eyes had the particular quality of someone who has crossed a line they can't uncross and is now simply deciding how to proceed. He began to speak, carefully, deliberately, the way he always spoke when he needed to sound reasonable rather than desperate. He said it hadn't been planned, that it had developed gradually, that he hadn't wanted to cause pain, that he had been trying to find a way through without devastating everything at once. He understood how it looked. It was complicated in ways that were hard to explain from the outside. There it was. The performance he had been rehearsing, probably for years, for the day he would need it. I've heard a version of this speech more times than I care to count, and what it always comes down to is this. When a man says, "I didn't want to cause pain," what he usually means is, "I didn't want to be present for the consequences." Not wanting to cause pain and not causing pain are two completely different things. One is a feeling, the other is a choice. Olga listened. She let him finish. She drank her tea. When he went quiet, she asked simply, "Is the boy yours?" He turned to the window. The evening light was going orange at the edges beyond the glass. He was quiet for a while, his right hand, flat on the table, pressed down slightly. She could see the skin pale around his fingertips. "The documents say otherwise," he said finally. "I'm not asking about the documents." A long pause. His jaw tightened. He exhaled once through his nose. "Yes." She nodded. She had expected this answer. Expecting it and hearing it are not the same thing. Something inside her contracted briefly, the finality of it pressing in, but she let it settle without letting it show. Her posture did not change. Her hands did not move. Her face gave him nothing. "How long has this been happening?" Another pause. He looked at the table. 6 years. 6 years. Not a mistake. Not a moment of weakness. A parallel life built on a parallel budget in a house the other life had helped to pay for. She looked at him steadily and let that number sit on the table between them for a moment where it belonged. He didn't look up. "Were you planning to leave?" "I thought about it." He shifted in his chair, a small movement, the kind that happens when a person is suddenly uncomfortable in a space they've occupied comfortably for years. "I didn't know how. The apartment. Everything was built. I didn't want to break it all at once." "But you were building something somewhere else," she said quietly. "Carefully, without rushing, for 6 years." She paused. "The dacha was part of that construction." He raised his eyes. Something in them shifted. Not guilt exactly. Wariness. He had just registered that the conversation was not going where he had expected it to go. He had arrived prepared for tears, accusations, demands for explanation. He was getting a debriefing. The difference was visible on him. His shoulders, which had been rolled slightly forward in the posture of a man bracing himself, came back and straightened. He was reclassifying the situation. She wasn't wounded. She was working. "The dacha is my inheritance," he said. His voice had taken on a firmness that hadn't been there a moment ago. The firmness of a man who has found a corner he can defend. "It came to me from my father before we were married. You know that." "I know," she said, "and I've never disputed it." A brief silence. He waited. But I'd like to ask you something. Who paid for the well? He said nothing. His eyes moved to the photographs on the table, then back to her, then to the window. The direction his gaze kept choosing was telling. And the heating system, and the 5 windows, and the lumber for the lean-to awning that, as it happens, was never actually built. She picked up her tea. I have the contracts, Andre. I have the payment receipts. I have bank records showing which account the transfers came from and when and how much. Some of them are from my account alone. The others came from money that was ours. He went very still, not the still of someone composing a response, the still of someone whose carefully built argument has just developed a large and inconvenient crack. You've spoken to a lawyer, he said, not a question. Yes. He stood and walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her, both hands in his pockets now, looking at the courtyard below. The ordinary Tuesday evening street, parked cars, lit windows, someone walking a dog along the sidewalk. A mellow scene for a man whose evening was not going mellow at all. I'm not looking for a war, he said at last, still facing the window. We can settle this like adults. I'll go. The apartment gets divided. The dacha is mine. It's a family inheritance. There's nothing to divide there. You just explained exactly why I needed a lawyer, she said. He turned around. The last of the conciliatory expression was gone. What remained was something more honest, tired, hard, and not particularly interested in pretending otherwise. You won't get anything out of that property, he said. The court doesn't divide inherited assets. You know that. I'm not asking them to divide it. I'm asking for compensation for the documented investments made from our marital funds during our marriage. She set down her cup. Those are different requests. Entirely different. And I have the paperwork for the second one. He looked at her for a long time. She watched his expression move through several things in quick succession. Calculation, then the recognition that the calculation wasn't working, then something colder and harder underneath both. She had always read that look as thoughtfulness. She saw now it was the face of a man who had just understood that the exit he had been building for 6 years had a door he hadn't accounted for, and the door was named Olga, and she had already walked through it. I didn't expect this from you, he said finally. I didn't expect a lot of things, she answered. But here we are. The conversation ended without a raised voice. No door slammed, no plates moved. He went to the other room. She put her documents into a folder, called her mother, and told her in 3 sentences that the conversation had taken place. Vera Pavlovna asked only one question. Did he confirm the boy is his? Yes. A pause. Good. Now move. 2 days later, Andre packed 2 bags in silence, took his personal documents from the desk drawer, and said he was leaving. He stood in the hallway for a moment with both bags in hand. He had forgotten his old jacket on the hook by the door. He didn't notice. The front door closed. Olga stood in the hallway and looked at the jacket on the hook. It had been there so long it had taken the shape of the wall behind it. It would stay there for another 2 weeks before she moved it, not because she forgot, but because there was no urgency, and urgency had stopped being something she owed him. The jacket had witnessed 14 years of comings and goings and had no particular opinion about any of them. In that sense, it was the most honest thing in the apartment. Then she went to the kitchen and made herself a cup of tea. The following week, Safronov filed the divorce petition. Simultaneously, he submitted a motion for protective measures, a prohibition on transferring or selling the jointly acquired car, and a restriction on large account transactions pending the outcome of the division proceedings. The judge granted the motion the same day. That evening, Andre called. His voice had the tightly controlled quality of a man who has discovered that someone has outmaneuvered him in a direction he hadn't anticipated. Why did you freeze the accounts? I didn't freeze anything, Olga said. The court imposed protective measures on jointly acquired marital property. It's a standard procedure in asset division cases. You understand this complicates everything. For whom? She asked. He didn't answer that. She could hear him breathing. that particular held-tight breathing that came when something had gone the wrong way and there was no quick fix available. He had gone into this expecting to manage the exit. He had not expected the exit to be managed back. "I offered to settle," he said at last. "You offered a settlement that suited you," she replied. "I prefer a settlement that suits me. That's why courts exist." She ended the call and set the phone on the table. Outside, the May evening was doing what May evenings do in that part of Russia, refusing to end. The sky above the rooftops was still a clear, insistent blue, the kind that makes it feel like the day has decided to stay indefinitely and nobody asked its opinion about it. Now here's something worth sitting with for a moment, because this story is full of lessons, but there is one that sits at the center of all of them. The most dangerous thing a capable woman can do is make herself too convenient. When you become the person who never asks, never pushes, never makes a scene, when your dependability becomes a resource someone else manages for their own purposes, you haven't kept the peace. You funded someone else's construction project. Olga's patience wasn't a character flaw, but her silence was something she had chosen, and choosing differently was also available to her. The moment she chose it, everything changed. The trial lasted 4 months. Andrei hired a lawyer, young, loud, and deeply invested in the performance of certainty. His name was never relevant. What was relevant was that he arrived at the first hearing in a suit that was slightly too new, with a briefcase that he set on the table with a small, deliberate thud, the way people do when they want the room to register that they have arrived. He explained at considerable length that inherited property is legally untouchable, that there was no legitimate basis for any claim against the dacha, and that the plaintiff's case rested on a fundamental misunderstanding of the relevant statutes. He spoke for 11 minutes without being asked a question. He had the energy of someone who had just passed the bar exam and was going to make absolutely sure everyone in the room knew it. Safronov let him finish. Then he placed the documents on the judge's table, one at a time in chronological order, each one labeled, each one dated. The well contract, the payment confirmation in Olga's name, the boiler deposit from her account, the window installation receipt, the building supply receipts from the envelope her mother had kept, bank statements showing the transfer dates, each item cross-referenced with the next. The judge was a woman of around 50 with very attentive eyes and a way of reading documents that suggested she was actually reading them, not performing the appearance of reading them. She asked clarifying questions. She asked Andrei's lawyer, still confident at this point, still comfortable with his briefcase, to provide documentation supporting the claim that the improvements had been paid from pre-marital personal funds. There were no such documents. His card had always been blocked, as it turned out, on the days that mattered. The young lawyer's briefcase thud was noticeably less dramatic at the second hearing. At the third hearing, Safronov introduced the bank statements, cross-referenced by date. Andrei's lawyer objected twice on procedural grounds. The judge reviewed the objections and overruled both. He wrote something in his notepad with the energy of a man who is determined to remain useful. At the fourth hearing, Natalia Bekarova testified. She arrived slightly anxious, but spoke with complete confidence. She had observed a young, dark-haired woman and a small boy at the Jarov property on at least 3 separate occasions, all in Olga's absence. The boy had moved through the property with the ease of familiarity. The woman had performed household activities, hanging laundry, tending the garden, receiving deliveries at the gate. She had not behaved as a guest. She had behaved as someone for whom this was an ordinary Tuesday. Andrei sat during these testimonies with a face that had gone very still and very careful. His lawyer objected on relevance grounds and launched into a brief speech about the limits of what neighbor observations could establish under the relevant legal framework. Safronov explained, quietly and briefly, how the pattern of use was material to the court's full understanding of the case context. The judge noted it and moved on. The young lawyer wrote something else in his notepad. At this point, it seemed likely that he was mostly drawing. In late September, the ruling came down. The marriage was dissolved. The car, purchased 4 years into the marriage from jointly held funds, was ruled a marital asset subject to division. Andrei could buy out Olga's half at current market value, or agree to a sale with proceeds split equally. The dacha remained his. Inherited title, not subject to division. That was expected, and it was correct, and Olga had never asked for otherwise. But the court found that during the marriage, significant marital funds had been used to substantially improve the inherited property, the well, the heating system, the windows, each documented as capital investment, not routine maintenance. The combined confirmed sum was considerable. Olga was awarded financial compensation equal to half the documented marital expenditure. The apartment was divided equally. Safronov called her when it was over. He said simply, "Everything that was available to take from this position, we took." "I understand," she said. "How are you?" "Fine," she said, and it was true. Andrei appealed the compensation ruling. The appellate panel reviewed the record over 6 weeks and found no grounds to overturn the lower court's decision. The ruling stood. The young lawyer, who had arrived at the first hearing with a thudding briefcase and 11 minutes of unopposed speech, submitted the appeal brief in writing and did not appear in person. Some lessons are learned the expensive way. When the final payments arrived, her share of the car's value, the property improvement compensation, Olga sat at the kitchen table in her new apartment and looked at the bank notification on her phone. The number on the screen was not a victory. It wasn't a prize. It was a return. The return of what had always been hers by right and had been managed quietly and efficiently for someone else's benefit for the better part of a decade. That specific feeling, not triumph but the restoration of a correct order, was, she later thought, the most honest feeling she had ever had about money. Drawing a line isn't cruelty. It isn't even conflict. It's just a person deciding, with full clarity, that what belongs to them belongs to them. Andrei moved into the dacha with Ludmila and Kirill. It was the outcome he had planned. The new family, his own house, the beginning he had been building toward, piece by piece, for years. He got it, and it turned out to be precisely what it was. The real version of the thing he had been imagining from a comfortable distance. Now there is a particular kind of justice that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a gavel or a headline. It just quietly becomes the texture of someone's daily life. Pay attention to this next part. The comfortable distance had come with certain cushions he no longer had. A stable shared household. A wife whose steadiness had absorbed a great deal of the weight of daily life. A dacha improved with money he hadn't entirely spent on his own. Without those things, the arithmetic of the situation became considerably less comfortable. The court payments, the lawyer fees, the compensation, all of it hit his finances at once and removed what he had thought of as his reserve. The dacha, which in his planning had been a ready-made nest, turned out in practice to be an aging property with continuous costs. The heating system needed servicing that autumn. The roof, which he had been planning to fix eventually for 2 years, began leaking after the first serious October rain. The appliances had been bought at different times over the years and were now, inconveniently, all approaching the end of their service lives at roughly the same moment, as if they had all attended the same meeting and decided to retire together. Ludmila had waited 6 years for this. She had imagined certainty, stability, a man beside her in a real life, not the compressed, careful, always borrowed version they had been living in the cracks of someone else's schedule. What she got was real, but it was also a lot of damp ceiling and a heating bill that took a painful percentage of a gas technician's monthly salary. In October, she filed to have Andrei's paternity of Kirill legally established. Not in anger, from practical necessity. The boy needed to be on his father's insurance. He needed documented support. She had every right to both, and she had always known it. Andrei acknowledged the paternity voluntarily. The child support order was established. The arithmetic, which had already been unkind, became genuinely unforgiving. What had been romantic at a careful distance turned out to be ordinary up close. Andrei came home from work tired and went quiet, which was, it turned out, what he had always done. He found it difficult to shift from the detachment of his workday into the full presence a close family required. He had always been good at keeping things in separate compartments. That skill, so useful for years, now worked against him. His family was in one compartment, and he kept arriving in a different one. Ludmila had expected the man she had known in their hidden hours. She discovered that the person you know in stolen time and the person you live with every day are not two different people. They are the same person, seen from different distances, and from this distance, the ordinary weight of him was very clear. How many people do you know who spent years wanting a thing, really wanting it, building toward it, sacrificing for it, and then got it, only to find out that what they'd been wanting was the wanting itself? The version that lived only in the gap between what was and what could be. Once you close that gap, you're just living. And living with this particular man turned out to be exactly what living with this particular man had always been. They did not separate immediately, but what had held them together, the urgency, the secrecy, the sense of something hard won, evaporated the moment it became the only available option. What remained was a shared house, a child, a leaking roof, and two people who had each believed in a version of this life that turned out to be simpler and harder and considerably less romantic than advertised. Life has a way of doing that to carefully constructed plans. One afternoon in November, Andre was in the city on an errand. He was coming out of a business office near the district center when he saw Olga leaving her clinic across the street. She was wearing a beige coat, her bag over one shoulder, her hair simply arranged. Beside her, straight-backed in her dark jacket, was Vera Pavlovna, apparently mid-story, talking with the particular animation she reserved for things she found genuinely amusing. Olga was listening and smiling. Not a performed smile, the easy, unguarded kind that comes when you are with someone you love and the afternoon is pleasant and there is nowhere urgent you need to be. She saw him. She stopped for 1 second. She gave him a short nod. No warmth, no coldness, the precise acknowledgement you give someone you knew well once and no longer have business with. Then she took her mother's arm and walked on. She didn't look back. Andre stood by his car and watched them go. They turned the corner, they were gone. And the thing was, she was not performing anything. There was no message in her posture directed at him. She simply had somewhere to go and someone she wanted to walk with. He was a detail in an afternoon that had moved well past him. That right there, that nod, that arm in arm, that not looking back, is what it actually looks like when someone is done. Not angry, not sad, just done. No performance, no signal, no residue. That is the posture of a woman who got every single thing that belonged to her and left nothing behind that didn't. He got in the car and drove back to the dacha. That autumn, in her new apartment, Olga stopped waking at 3 in the morning. She had done it for most of the previous year, jolted out of sleep by the low, nameless weight of a situation she couldn't name and couldn't resolve. That was gone. She didn't notice it go. She simply woke one morning and realized the ceiling above her was bright and her mind was clear and she had slept without interruption. And she had been sleeping that way for some time without having marked the moment it started. Work went on its own way. Her colleagues knew she had divorced. They didn't ask about the details. They gave her the small courtesy of letting her be whoever she was now without requiring her to explain it. Svetlana asked once simply, "How did it go?" "Fine," Olga said. "Thank you for the number." Svetlana nodded. That was the entire conversation, and it was sufficient. Her new apartment was small and entirely hers. She arranged it in the order that made sense to her, without negotiation, without deference to anyone else's habits. The quiet in the evenings had a different quality than the quiet she had lived with before. The old quiet had been the absence of conversation, the particular silence of two people who have run out of the easy version and haven't found the harder one. This quiet was chosen. It belonged to her. It sounded nothing like the other kind. On Sunday mornings, she allowed herself to slow down. She read. She cooked without hurrying. Sometimes she simply sat with coffee at the window and watched the street below. The neighborhood going about its weekend, indifferent and ordinary, and entirely hers to observe without obligation. She had thought for years that these unhurried moments were a kind of emptiness, time that needed filling. She understood now that they were the opposite. They were space. Space she had been too busy sustaining someone else's double life to notice she was missing. Vera Pavlovna called every few days. They talked about small things and occasionally large ones. Her mother never said anything that resembled "I told you so." She never returned to the subject of Andre with any particular feeling. Only once, over tea on a weekend visit, she looked out the window at the autumn trees and said, "I'm glad you didn't wait for it to resolve itself." It wouldn't have resolved itself. No, it would have continued exactly as long as you let it. Her mother picked up her cup. The only thing that changed it was you deciding it would change. Olga thought about that for a moment. Then she nodded, because it was true, and it was the kind of truth that didn't require anything added to it. That Sunday, for the first time, they went to the small cafe near the park that Vera Pavlovna had mentioned 3 times in passing over the past months. Wooden tables, the smell of fresh pastry, a window table with a view of the avenue and the yellow leaves still clinging to the trees in the mid-autumn light. They ordered coffee and apple cake and sat across from each other. Vera Pavlovna was mid-story about the neighbor on the 3rd floor. Apparently, the woman had been conducting a months-long feud with the building manager over a mailbox key and had recently escalated to leaving handwritten notes in the elevator, each one more formally addressed than the last. And Olga was laughing, actually laughing, the easy kind that doesn't announce itself, and she thought, with no particular drama, "This is enough. This, right here. This was worth every single careful step it took to get to it. Not every story ends with fireworks. Not every right decision announces itself with applause. Sometimes the reward is just a Sunday that belongs entirely to you, with apple cake and yellow leaves and a mother who says what she means and expects the same in return." You want to know the real lesson here? It isn't about divorce strategy. It isn't about keeping your receipts, although you absolutely should keep your receipts. The real lesson is simpler and much harder. It's this: your willingness to endure discomfort should never become someone else's operating budget. The moment your patience turns into a resource being managed on your behalf by someone with different interests, that is the moment patience has stopped serving you and started serving them. You're allowed to notice that. You're allowed to act on it. Olga did, quietly, methodically, and without a single wasted move. And if this story found something in you that recognized itself, drop us a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Tell us what you're taking with you from this one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time, because the next story is already waiting, and I promise it'll be worth every minute. I'll see you in the next one.